Good day, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Conversations with AARP in the Virgin Islands. I'm Troy Deshabert Schuster, State Director for AARP in this territory. AARP, the nation's largest social change organization, has been at the forefront of empowering the 50 years of age and older population, enabling them to choose how they live as they age. Through its unwavering commitment to this effort, AARP has transformed the lives of the more than 100 million Americans and their families we serve, ensuring that they can continue to thrive and contribute to society. In a time where the aging population is rapidly increasing, it is crucial that we recognize the unique challenges faced by older Americans. One such issue is the growing phenomenon that affects hundreds and thousands of older Americans, and that is abuse and financial exploitation. Research has shown that 1 in 6 older adults experience some form of abuse every year. As such, elder abuse demands a multifaceted response, which focuses on protecting the rights of older people. With our advocacy efforts, AARP has fought for legislative changes to federal and state laws and regulations that prevent this type of abuse. While many of the statutes have provided protections for older adults, there is still more that we can do to champion this vital cause. Joining our conversation today is Attorney Paul Greenwood, a former San Diego Deputy District Attorney and expert in AARP's Fraud Watch Network, who has dedicated his career now to combating elder abuse and safeguarding the welfare of older adults. Throughout today's discussion, we will explore the various forms of abuse endured by older adults and, most importantly, highlight the legislative changes that we can advocate for to combat this issue and help protect you and your family. And so, Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Troy. Good to be with you.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure, and it's so wonderful that you have now in your retirement, you are so dedicated to the work of AARP as one of our national volunteers, helping us with our Fraud Watch network and helping us to combat elder abuse in all of its forms. And as of recent, you've been helping us here in the Virgin Islands to develop, to craft legislation, to amend our Virgin Islands Code to improve the protections for our older adults. So, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and your career as a prosecutor.
Sure. And as you can probably detect, I was originally from the UK, grew up in southern England, became a lawyer over there. They called me a solicitor. For 13 years, I practiced law in the southern area of England. And during that time, I fell in love with a beautiful young lady from San Diego. I had been traveling through the United States before I became a lawyer and met Sue. And in 1978, we were married. She joined me in England. But through a series of circumstances, we decided back in the 1991 to bring Sue back to her hometown of San Diego. So I requalified as a lawyer. And in 1993, I joined the district attorney's office and spent an amazing 25 years there as a career prosecutor. And Troy, what was interesting was for 22 of those years, I specialized in one area of criminal prosecution, which was prosecuting people who took advantage of older adults.
Great. And so, how long have you been volunteering with AARP nationally?
Well, it's been really a wonderful opportunity. Soon after I retired from the DA's office, I was approached by your national committee to become an AARP ambassador. And, you know, it seemed to be, to me, a perfect fit because what I wanted to do, Troy, was to share all the lessons that I've learned in the courtroom, battling particularly financial exploitation of older adults. And because I was also a firm believer in what AARP stands for, in fact, I've been a member for 21 years. And so it seemed to me to be a perfect fit to be able to pass on the experiences I've learned in forms of webinars and then in forms of in-person presentations too. So it's been almost 5 years. It's been a wonderful 5 years.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for volunteering for AARP and lending us your great expertise and continuing the fight to protect older adults all across the country from fraud in all of its forms and elder abuse. And as we were discussing just prior to the show, it seems as though elder abuse is on the rise all across the country. I know it certainly is here in the Virgin Islands since the pandemic and the ensuing inflation. What would you say is the cause of that increase in the United States mainland? Would it be the same thing, or what are you seeing there?
I do. I think human nature is the same wherever you live, and it's not just confined to the United States. It's global phenomenon, and a lot of different reasons. You know, demographics tell us, right, Troy, that we are an aging society. The fastest growing segment of our whole population is the over 85s. We're all living longer. Older adults tend to be people who have worked hard and saved, so they do have assets which unfortunately are very attractive to would-be scammers and even family members and other folks. And I think the pandemic has had a lot to do with it too, because we have all been in forced isolation. We've become more reliant upon the internet, emails, webinars, and other things. And so the predators out there have seized upon the isolation factor to move in on us through social media, through the internet, and through unannounced visits to our own homes.
And elder abuse is so very multifaceted. Oftentimes, we think of elder abuse either as a scammer or a con artist getting money out of an older person, or maybe a relative or a close friend of an older person getting money. But we know there's so many other forms of elder abuse. Can you give us an overview of the various forms of elder abuse?
Sure, and it does. It ranges, and this is based upon my own courtroom trial experience from, unfortunately, homicides, where the perpetrator tends to be a family member rather than a stranger, to physical assaults, you know, the slapping, the pushing, the hitting. And the problem with some of these, what we would call minor physical pushings, can lead to devastating impacts on an older adult. You know, a simple push out of anger can lead to a broken hip, which can lead to so many other challenges for the older adult. Then you've got the whole issue of neglect, where you have a bedridden older adult who needs to be turned every 2 hours, but is left in their own feces and urine for weeks, sometimes on end, until unfortunately sometimes they die. Then there's this hidden subject of sexual assaults of older adults. And then you've got abandonment and what I call forced imprisonment, where you will actually leave an older adult alone without the ability to leave. And then this whole huge area of financial exploitation. And as you pointed out, it's multifaceted. So there are times when I would prosecute cases, Troy, where there was an allegation of a physical assault with a financial exploitation and a neglect as well.
Yes, yeah, they often do come in pairs and triplets, it seems like. One thing I didn't hear you mention is sexual abuse. We see that sometimes too, right? Sexual abuse of older people, sometimes by their own family members, sometimes by caregivers, and that's another thing that we need to fight against and to make people more aware of.
Well, that's true, and it is often called the hidden crime. It's the crime that people are reluctant to own up to discuss. Unfortunately, people think, well, sexual assault occurs with younger people as victims. No, it doesn't happen that way. And unfortunately, I did prosecute a number of cases, primarily where the older victim was in a community setting, in a facility, assisted living or skilled nursing, and where the perpetrator was a male caregiver.
Yeah, here in the Virgin Islands, we have an interesting form of neglect or abandonment that we're always dealing with, and that happens in the hospitals. An
Mm.
older person is brought in to be treated for an acute illness. The the acute nature of the illness or disease has gone away, and it's time for them to be discharged, and their family refuses to pick them up, and they are left there. We have seen patients abandoned in the hospital for upwards of 2 years, 3 years. Sometimes they die there of some other kind of opportunistic disease, that lurks around in the hospital. Have you heard of cases like this on the mainland as well, or in your practice?
Yes, I have, and we've often termed it patient dumping at the front door of the hospital, and sometimes it's done out of sheer frustration, out of sheer desperation, and sometimes there's an almost an inbuilt defense that the perpetrator has, Troy, because they will say, "Well, I'm the only sibling that actually cared about my mum, and I tried what I could. My other siblings, they couldn't care less. So I ended up, I thought, you know what? I'm just going to leave them with in the proper hands who can actually take care of them." And so those kind of cases are challenging to prove as criminal because they have inbuilt sympathy for them. But again, it puts the emphasis and the responsibility back on the state, back on the Virgin Islands. You know, the expense of caring for these older adults who are basically abandoned. It can lead to tragic circumstances, and I just wish it didn't get that far, Troy. I wish that the neighbors maybe could be hearing things, seeing things, could be seeing the buildup of frustration, and before that dumping takes place, somebody makes a call to Adult Protective Services so there can be proper intervention before it gets to that last stage.
As you were having discussions with us at AARP here in the Virgin Islands, and that issue of neglect or abandonment came up, you made it clear or made us aware that that can be considered attempted homicide or even homicide. Can you talk a little more to that?
Sure. And you know, the whole aspect of neglect, we tend to think of that as a sort of we call it civil type of negligence type of action, whereas it can cross the line into criminal conduct, where I talk about it in terms of um, turning a blind eye to the obvious, you know, where you actually are in a position of providing care for a loved one or as a paid caregiver. You see something which clearly requires medical intervention and you simply do not do anything about it. You avoid any kind of interaction with the medical authorities. And if that then, for example, leads to bed sores or what we call ulcers or pressure sores, which then can turn really bad very quickly, and that can lead to the shutdown of primary organs in the body. I mean, ultimately, a neglect case could end up as a homicide. And I've had cases, unfortunately, like that, where the paramedics walk in and the elderly person is already deceased.
Yeah, and it's so very disturbing and shocking that people could do that to their own family, but we see it all the time on the news, and it is a reality that we have to face and to work against constantly. Uh, can you tell us what are some of the common signs that an older adult is experiencing abuse? If we're on the outside looking in, what kind of signs can we be looking for?
You know, I always talk about this that with adult children, you look for a change in your older relatives' behavior, in their change in routine. You know, we're all people of a habit, are we not, Troy? And when there's a change in that typical routine, that should alert us to something is different, and we need to find out what is causing that difference. Isolation can be a big red flag. So you want to make a visit, you knock on the door, and somebody's telling you, "No, this is not a good time to come in. She's sleeping. He's under the weather. Can you come back another day?" Huge red flag. If you are seeing somebody and there's a radical change in their appearance, they've lost weight, or there's signs of bruising that wasn't there before. Uh, what I always tell people is go with your gut. If your gut tells you something is wrong, no one's going to blame you for picking up the phone and calling Adult Protective Services and just say, I've really got some concerns about my neighbor, about my friend, about my relative. Could you pay a visit and just see how they're doing? And unless you're what we call a mandated reporter, Troy, you don't have to give your name. You can remain anonymous. And I think, the biggest barrier that I've noticed over all the many years I've been involved in this is silence. If silence becomes the norm, then unfortunately more and more people become victims of abuse and exploitation and neglect. So I always say, listen to your gut, and if something just doesn't look right with your friend, your neighbor, your relative, make a call.
Oftentimes, people don't see any external signs, and oftentimes the person being victimized, being abused, is reluctant to report the situation
Mm,
because they may be relying on this person who's abusing them for their care, and they don't know who to turn to afterward. How
mm.
how can we speak to people like this? How can we encourage them to report it? How can we show them that there is hope for them, for their care and so forth after reporting it?
That's a great point. And, I've had the privilege of talking to so many victims during my career. And uh, in many of these cases, I would say, and I would try to say it without any kind of judgmental tone to my voice or anything like that, why did you not want to report this? Because ultimately the case was discovered through some other means. And often it was, well, Mr. Greenwood, I, I just didn't want to lose my independence. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that we need to educate folks about is by identifying myself as a victim, there's no risk typically of the government coming in and swooping me off my feet and taking me out of my home and placing me into a skilled nursing facility or some kind of nursing home. But that is the fear that a lot of victims have. And it's the fear that is instilled in them by the perpetrator, the family member, the caregiver, the stranger. If you dare tell the police what's happened, they're going to arrest me, but then they're going to find that you need help, and they're going to take you out of the house. So we need to reassure folks that by coming forward, not only will you not lose your independence, but it will be an empowerment for you. You have a voice, and we need to hold the perpetrator accountable. And if we don't hold the perpetrator accountable, it may not be you next time as the next victim; it's somebody else. And how
Right.
would you feel if someone else became a victim of the same kind of experience that you've gone through?
Just now you touched on something that reminds me of a term, undue influence.
Mm.
All right, talk to us about undue influence.
Boy, Troy, yes, this is such a subtle form that the perpetrator will use. Because typically police officers are looking for evidence of threats, of a gun being pointed at you or a knife saying, okay, hand over your money, give me your wallet, give me your purse. But perpetrators of financial elder exploitation very rarely use violence. They'll use charm. They'll use flowers. So many of my victims said, but Mr. Greenwood, he reminded me so much of my own son. And this is what it is. It's using this ability to get the victim to believe in you, to trust you, to possibly fall in love with you. The perpetrator will use terms of affection, will use terms of commonality, so that the victim feels bonded towards the perpetrator. And then through very subtle means, the perpetrator will influence the victim to isolate the victim from their existing community and social partners, so that the victim becomes totally reliant on the perpetrator. And that is what undue influence is all about. And so often that is missed by the police, not just in the Virgin Islands, but all over the United States, because they're saying, well, where's the crime? But the crime has actually occurred through these subtleties.
It's like playing mind games on somebody, right? It's like playing mind games on the most vulnerable person.
It's so
It's
true.
such an awful form of manipulation.
Yeah.
And then sometimes they even go to the extent of making the victim feel like they're the ones who are guilty, like they're the ones who made the decision to give the money, and that it must be kept a secret, or other people will get upset with the victim, and the mind games just go on and on, and it gets worse.
It's so true.
So
And and here's the dilemma, because a relative or a responsible neighbor who sees it going on may have this conversation with the victim and start probing the motives of the perpetrator. That makes the victim sometimes more defensive. How dare you suggest that I'm losing my mind, right? How dare you think that I don't
right.
know how to make proper decisions? And so they become more defensive in their responses. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when we're trying to work with these people who are victims of undue influence, and bringing them to a place where they can come forward and report, we have to work against this emotional psychological manipulation. It becomes so very difficult. And
What mm, it's so true, Troy, and that this is why, and I'm so glad you're raising this as part of our conversation, because until we begin to train ourselves to understand how undue influence works, we won't really be able to crack um, how it works, or identify the perpetrator, or even identify the perpetrator as being a criminal. And that is the big challenge that I have faced during my career as a prosecutor, because ultimately, when you're dealing with theft, the defense will always be, but she wanted me to have it. It was a gift. Or, oh, I just borrowed it. And so often that false defense is accepted by law enforcement. Well, Greenwood, he didn't threaten her, and she voluntarily gave it to him, so there's no crime. So that's why training about undue influence to law enforcement, to other prosecutors, as well as to the general community, is so vital, Troy.
yes, almost like we need courses in psychology and counseling to help the prosecutors and law enforcement work through this.
So true,
Yes.
and yeah, I mean, they talk about artificial intelligence, right? But the intelligence of the perpetrators, who have almost become trained psychologists, they know which buttons to push. They know what's going to get to the heart of the victim, where the heart will then overrule the brain, so that when it comes time to sign a quitclaim deed or change the will, the victim will do it very willingly.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, what advice can you offer advocates such as AARP and other organizations or individuals in building awareness about elder abuse that would encourage community members to speak about this issue?
Well, I I
What
I,
advice can
I
you give
really
to
do
us?
want, yeah, I really want to give a shout out though to AARP, that because they have made elder exploitation a priority, and so I think we've just got to find more ways to make the public aware of the resources that are available through AARP, through their website, through their magazine, through the Fraud Watch network, as to how we can all avail ourselves. And the ironic thing is, you don't even have to be a member to take advantage of all these great resources, but also for AARP to be a community resource with other professional organizations. One thing I've really been excited about is the linking up that AARP are having with some, for example, financial fraud investigator associations around the country. So now you're getting these fraud conferences, and AARP is one of the chief sponsors or chief presenters at these conferences. We need to build a network of professionals working in our communities to be part of a bigger team. It's not, we can't do it just on our own, but together we can sure make a difference.
And here in the Virgin Islands, as you know, Paul, but for our listening and viewing audience, AARP, we're very involved in fighting elder abuse, elder exploitation in all of its forms. We have ARP's Fraud Watch network extended to the Virgin Islands, and people can join that. If you visit aarp.org, you can find out more about the Fraud Watch network and enroll free of charge and gain lots and lots of information about frauds and scams all across the country and in the Virgin Islands. Also, we are working on an anti-elder abuse piece of legislation, a very comprehensive one. Here in the Virgin Islands ARP, we're working with the FBI, with the United States Department of Justice, with the Adult Protective Services of our local Department of Human Services, and also with you. You've been a great help to us joining in these meetings to craft this and also to bring educational awareness to it. We've been conducting workshops on elder abuse. Actually, um, the most recent series, part of the series that we did, we even educated the banks as to how to
Mm.
detect elder financial abuse and how to report it. So the financial institutions are aware, and we have more of these workshops coming up later in the year. So please do visit our Facebook page, AARP Virgin Islands, also our website, which is aarp.org/VI, and you can gain lots of information there. The workshops are free of charge to everybody. We encourage everybody to attend, no matter how old or how young you are. Um, you may be a victim of it one of these days yourself, or you may have a loved one who is being victimized now, or at least you could learn how to prevent your loved one from being victimized. So we really encourage everybody to participate in these workshops and to look forward to this great piece of legislation. So, Paul, in our last minute, what final parting words do you have for us?
Well, thank you, Troy. Be part of the effort. You know, everyone. It takes the whole community to be part of the remedy for this. We'll never eradicate elder financial exploitation, but we can certainly put a dent into it. And I think just go again. My theme is go with your gut. If you see something which just doesn't look good, doesn't look right, please. The worst thing we can do is stay silent. Let's pick up that phone, call Adult Protective Services, and let them then do their job. And I just look forward to be part of this continuing effort in the Virgin Islands. And kudos to you and to AARP for taking the lead in this.
Thanks so much, Paul. And Attorney Paul Greenwood, thank you for joining us today for this edition of Conversations with AARP in the Virgin Islands. And thank you for helping us here in the Virgin Islands with our workshops and to craft great legislation. And we look forward to having you on a future episode of the show.
We'd love that. Thanks so much, Troy.
Thank you.